In the town of Graystone, nestled in the crook of the rolling highlands, life moved at a gentle pace, interrupted only by the changing of the seasons and the occasional festival in the town square. At the center of this square stood the grand clock tower, a monolith of stone and iron that had been the pride of Graystone in its heyday. But the clock had not chimed in over a century. Its hands were forever frozen at 11:59, and its once proud face had dulled with grime and neglect. To the newer residents, the tower was an odd relic, a forgotten emblem of a bygone time. For the older townsfolk, however, the tower was a symbol they avoided speaking of. Whispers of its history were buried deep beneath polite smiles and quick changes of subject. No one could say exactly why the clock stopped. Some blamed mechanical failure, others a freak lightning strike. But one thing was certain: Graystone had been content to leave the tower in silence. It was on a stormy night that the clock's silence was broken. The storm had rolled in suddenly, bringing heavy rain that lashed against rooftops and flooded the cobbled streets. Wind howled between the buildings, tugging at shutters and shaking doors. Bolts of lightning illuminated the town in stark flashes, casting the square in an eerie, strobe-like glow. Thunder roared overhead, echoing off the hills, louder than any had heard in years. Most of Graystone's residents had retreated indoors, lighting candles and drawing curtains against the fury of the weather. Then came the sound, low and guttural. It started as a grinding noise that seemed to emanate from the heart of the storm itself. Those who heard it leaned closer to their windows, straining to identify the source. It grew louder, a metallic groan that reverberated through the square. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the first chime rang out. It was a deep, resonant tone that cut through the roar of the storm like a knife. It was not the weak, muffled toll of an old bell. It was strong and clear, commanding attention. Windows flew open, heads poked out, and the square was soon filled with the sound of murmured disbelief. "The clock," someone whispered, their voice trembling with a mixture of awe and dread. The clock tower's hands, still visible in the flickering light of the storm, were moving again. The grinding noise had been its ancient gears groaning back to life, and now the clock was working once more. As the hands slowly reached midnight, the tower released a sequence of 12 booming chimes, each one heavier and more resonant than the last. The final chime seemed to echo endlessly, fading only as the storm itself began to subside. The square fell into silence, save for the whispers of the rain. No one dared to approach the tower, and eventually curtains were drawn and candles extinguished. But the unease lingered, a palpable weight that pressed down on Graystone even as the storm moved on. Morning came, bright and clear, as if the storm had never passed. The town square, so empty the night before, now bustled with quiet activity. Vendors set up their carts, children played under the watchful eyes of their mothers, and workers hurried to their tasks. Yet, despite the normalcy, the mood was tense. Conversations were hushed, and eyes darted toward the clock tower as if expecting it to spring to life again. The news of Julia Crane's death broke just after breakfast. Julia was the town librarian, a kind-hearted woman who had spent her life cataloging and preserving the history of Graystone. Her death was sudden and unexplained. She had been found by a neighbor who came to check on her after she failed to open the library that morning. Julia was discovered in her bed, her face peaceful, as if she had merely drifted off to sleep. The doctor could find no clear cause. Her heart had simply stopped. The town was shaken by the news. Julia had been in good health, and there was no reason for her to die so suddenly. Whispers spread quickly, fueled by the events of the night before. The clock's chiming and her death were connected, some said. Others dismissed it as superstition. Still, there were those who began to speak in hushed tones of old stories, of the time when the clock last stopped, and the deaths that followed. The second death came the very next night. Richard Collins was one of Graystone's wealthiest residents, a banker whose family had lived in the town for generations. He had been known for his sharp business acumen and his ability to sniff out opportunity. On this night, he stayed late at his office, going over ledgers by the light of an oil lamp. When the clock began to chime at midnight, Richard looked up from his desk, startled. He glanced at the window, then at the small safe in the corner of the room. When morning came, Richard was found dead. His body was inside the safe, the heavy door locked from the outside. It was a gruesome and baffling scene. The safe was airtight, and he had suffocated within. The door's mechanism showed no signs of tampering, and no one could explain how it had been sealed. The town's unease turned to fear. 2 deaths, both sudden and inexplicable, and both following the tolling of the clock. The whispers grew louder, but the truth remained elusive. On the 3rd night, the clock chimed again, and another life was claimed. This time it was Martin Lewis, a retired builder who had spent his life restoring Graystone's historic structures. Martin was known for his meticulous work and his devotion to the preservation of the town's architectural heritage. He had even worked on the clock tower in his youth, though he rarely spoke of it. Martin's death was found the next morning at the bottom of the staircase in his home. The fall should not have been fatal, but his neck was broken, and his body lay twisted as if he had been flung down with tremendous force. There were no witnesses, no signs of struggle, just the faint scent of iron and grease lingering in the air. By now, the pattern was undeniable. The clock had returned to life, and with it, death had come to Graystone. People began locking their doors at dusk, whispering prayers against whatever curse had awoken. The town square emptied earlier and earlier, leaving the clock tower to stand alone, its face grim and unyielding. For Elyse Harper, a journalist new to Graystone, the events were too strange to ignore. She had come to the town seeking a quiet place to write, but the string of deaths captured her curiosity. As she listened to the stories and observed the growing fear among the townsfolk, Elyse began to suspect that there was more to the clock tower's awakening than mere coincidence. What had brought the clock back to life? Why were these deaths following its chimes? And why did the older residents grow so silent when the subject of the tower's history arose? Elyse resolved to find the answers, unaware of how deeply her search would entangle her in Graystone's dark past. The days that followed Martin Lewis's death were drenched in tension. The clock tower loomed over the square like a silent sentinel, its face now alive with a steady, rhythmic movement. The chimes, though rare, carried a sinister weight, as if each toll were a harbinger of doom. The townsfolk grew increasingly wary, their steps quickening as they passed beneath the tower's shadow. Businesses near the square reported dwindling customers. Even the children, usually impervious to superstition, avoided the area. Whispers had become a daily ritual. 3 deaths, one shopkeeper murmured to another as they adjusted their displays. 3 nights in a row. Coincidence, her companion replied, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. And the clock? You think it's coincidence that it starts ticking, and now people are dying? The first shopkeeper fell silent, but her gaze drifted upward to the tower's distant face, where the hands continued their relentless march toward the next midnight. Elyse Harper was not one to shy away from a mystery. She had moved to Graystone with the intention of escaping the frantic pace of city life, seeking solace in the quiet charm of a small town. But the deaths, coupled with the sudden revival of the clock tower, had ensnared her journalistic instincts. There was a story here, one that the town seemed determined to keep buried. Her first step was to examine the locations connected to the victims. Julia Crane's home was modest and well-kept, her reputation as a meticulous librarian evident in every corner. What caught Elise's attention, however, was a framed sketch on Julia's desk, an intricate design of gears and clockwork, signed only with the letter T. The second stop was Richard Collins's office. The bankers had yet to clear out his belongings, and the room remained as it had been the night he died. Elyse was particularly drawn to the safe, an imposing iron structure adorned with delicate carvings. Though the mechanism had been examined by local authorities, its door remained resolutely closed. Elyse couldn't help but notice the faint engraving at the base of the safe, again, the letter T. At Martin Lewis's home, the remnants of the staircase where he'd fallen were marked with dried blood. Among the scattered papers in his study, Elyse found an old ledger detailing his restoration projects. The largest entry was for the clock tower itself. His notes were brief but telling. The mechanism is flawless, beyond anything I've worked on. Almost alive. On the fourth night, the clock chimed again. The sound reverberated through the town, loud and mournful, as though mourning its victims. By now, no one doubted the connection between the chimes and the deaths. Windows stayed shut, doors were bolted, and not a soul dared to step into the square after sunset. The next morning, the town awoke to another tragedy. Martha Green, the elderly owner of an antique shop, was found dead in her store. Martha's death was peculiar not for its manner. It appeared to be a heart attack, but for what she had been doing when she died. On the counter beside her was an array of objects from the store's inventory, a collection of old gears, springs, and mechanical parts. They were arranged in a pattern, a half-formed diagram that Elyse would later recognize as resembling the inner workings of the clock tower. The diagram was accompanied by a note, scrawled hastily in Martha's hand. "Forgive us. We didn't know." Elyse began to notice a pattern in the deaths. But it wasn't just the victims' connection to the town's historic structures. There was something else, an invisible thread connecting them to the clock tower itself. Each victim had, in some way, been tied to the tower's construction, restoration, or legacy. But the clues they left behind were fragmentary, as if revealing the full truth would invite more destruction. When Elyse asked the older residents about the clock tower, their reactions were telling. Some changed the subject abruptly, their faces darkening. Others refused to answer at all, their silence heavier than words. Only one, a frail man named Harold, offered a cryptic response. "You don't want to know," he muttered, his voice trembling. "The tower remembers. It always does." "The tower?" Elyse pressed. "What do you mean?" But Harold only shook his head, retreating into the safety of his home. Desperate for answers, Elyse turned to the town archives. She spent hours sifting through old records, finding little more than faded ledgers and council minutes. The clock tower's construction had been noted in great detail, but no mention was made of its creator. The records seemed deliberately vague, as though someone had gone to great lengths to obscure the identity of the person responsible for the tower's design. It wasn't until Elyse stumbled upon a bundle of old newspaper clippings that she found a lead. An article from over a century ago described the unveiling of the clock tower as a triumph for the town. The accompanying photograph showed a group of dignitaries standing proudly before the tower. At the edge of the frame stood a man who appeared out of place. He was young, with a solemn expression and oil-stained hands. The caption identified him only as the craftsman. Another clipping, dated several years later, chronicled a string of mysterious deaths in Graystone. Each one was linked to mechanical failures in buildings associated with the craftsman. The article made veiled accusations, questioning his role in the accidents. Elise's breath caught as she read the final lines. The craftsman's trial is set to begin next week. His guilt will determine whether the clock tower continues to stand as a symbol of progress or becomes a grim reminder of our town's folly. As Elyse pieced together the fragments of the craftsman's story, the clock struck 12 once again. This time, the toll was deeper, its sound vibrating through Graystone like the knell of a great bell. Elise's chest tightened as she waited for the inevitable news. At dawn, the body of Edward Finch, the town's mayor, was discovered in his study. Edward had been a vocal skeptic of the connection between the deaths and the clock tower, dismissing the fear as superstitious nonsense. But his death was as inexplicable as the others. A heavy ledger had fallen from the shelf above his desk, striking him with enough force to fracture his skull. Beside his body lay an open book, a registry of property transactions from the time of the clock tower's construction. The page was open to detail the transfer of land from an unnamed craftsman to the town council. Elyse couldn't ignore the mounting evidence. Each death seemed to be tied to a secret that Graystone's residents had worked hard to bury. The craftsman's name remained elusive, but his fingerprints were everywhere. In the design of the buildings, the mechanisms of the clock tower, and the guilt that lingered like a shadow over the town. As the clock continued its relentless march toward midnight, Elyse felt the weight of its chimes pressing down on her. The tower wasn't just a symbol, It was a judge, and its verdict was far from finished. The clock's unrelenting chimes had turned Graystone into a town of shadows. By the time Edward Finch's death was announced, fear had taken root so deeply that few dared venture outside after sundown. Shops closed early, shutters were drawn tight, and the once bustling town square was left to the silent watch of the clock tower. For Elyse Harper, the mystery had become more than an investigation. It was an obsession. The deaths were not random. They were part of a larger puzzle, one whose edges were slowly beginning to reveal themselves. The name of the craftsman still eluded her, but she now knew that the tower's history was tied to a betrayal so profound it had left a scar on the town that time could not erase. Elyse revisited the mayor's study, now cold and lifeless. The property registry that had been left open beside Edward Finch's body was her first clue. The ledger was a meticulous record of every transaction during the period when the clock tower was constructed. It documented not only the acquisition of land, but also the contracts for the tower's design and construction. Most entries were signed with familiar names: long-dead council members, wealthy landowners, and local officials. One entry, however, was starkly different. It bore no signature, only an initial, T. The accompanying note was terse but striking. Land transferred under duress. Dispute unresolved. Elyse felt a chill run down her spine. This was no ordinary transaction. Someone had been forced to relinquish their land, and that someone, she was certain, was the craftsman. Elise's next stop was the town archives, a labyrinthine room beneath the library filled with dusty records and forgotten histories. She spent hours combing through old council minutes, building permits, and correspondences, piecing together the story of the clock tower's creation. Slowly, a narrative emerged. The tower had been commissioned as a symbol of Graystone's ambition. The council had sought out the finest craftsman they could find, a young, enigmatic figure who arrived with a reputation for unmatched skill in engineering and design. The craftsman, known only as Thomas in scattered references, had been hired to construct not only the clock tower, but several other buildings around the square. His work was revolutionary. The clock tower itself was said to be a marvel of precision, its mechanisms so advanced that they seemed to defy the technology of the time. The town flourished under his designs, attracting visitors and wealth. But with success came envy. Among the documents, Elyse found a faded letter addressed to the council, its ink smudged and nearly illegible. The writer, whose identity was unclear, warned of the craftsman's growing influence. "He controls the heart of our town," the letter read. "Without him, we have nothing. This cannot stand." The letter was dated mere months before the first accusations against Thomas began to surface. The records painted a grim picture. A series of accidents, collapsing scaffolding, malfunctioning gates, even a fire in one of the buildings, were blamed on Thomas's designs. At first, he defended himself, providing detailed explanations for each incident. But the council, spurred on by whispers of sabotage and malice, turned against him. The charges escalated, and soon he was accused of intentionally causing harm to the town he had helped build. The trial was a farce, the verdict predetermined. Thomas was condemned not only for the accidents, but for imagined crimes of sorcery and unnatural influence. As Elyse read through the accounts, her hands trembled. The town had needed a scapegoat, and Thomas, brilliant, solitary, and misunderstood, had been an easy target. His final words, spoken before the jeering crowd that gathered for his execution, sent a shiver through Elyse. "I am not guilty, and you know this to be true. I will return." That night, the clock stopped at 11:59. As Elyse delved deeper, she began to notice a pattern not just in the deaths, but in the behavior of the town's elders. The few who had been alive during Thomas's trial, or whose families had been directly involved, were reluctant to speak. Yet their silences were telling. One elderly woman, Agnes Mulroney, finally broke under Elise's persistent questioning. Agnes, frail and bedridden, admitted that her father had been one of the council members who voted to convict Thomas. Her voice quivered as she recounted the stories passed down to her. "They took everything from him," she whispered. "His land, his work, his name. all because they wanted what he created. And when the accidents happened, they made sure the blame fell on him. My father. He knew it was wrong, but he stayed silent. Agnes gestured weakly to a small wooden box on her bedside table. Inside, Elyse found a fragment of a blueprint, its lines sharp and precise. It depicted a section of the clock tower's mechanism, with a curious annotation scribbled in the margin. Time is truth. Elyse's discoveries weighed heavily on her as the fifth night approached. She had unearthed enough to confirm that the deaths were no coincidence. Each victim was tied to the betrayal of Thomas, either through their ancestors or their connection to his work. Yet the exact nature of the clock's curse remained elusive. What force had reawakened it? And why now, after all these years? At midnight, the clock struck again. The sound was deafening, each chime reverberating through Elyse's chest like a physical blow. She clutched the fragment of the blueprint as if it might offer protection, though she knew it was futile. When morning came, the body of Gerald Price, the town's historian, was found in his home. Gerald had been researching the clock tower for years, though his findings had remained unpublished. His death was attributed to a fall from a ladder, but Elyse suspected otherwise. On his desk, amid stacks of papers, she found a single, typed note. The tower holds its secrets, but the cost of knowing is steep. By now, Elyse had pieced together much of Thomas's story. She understood that the clock tower was more than a marvel of engineering. It was a monument to betrayal, a symbol of Graystone's darkest hour. But the question remained, how could she stop it? The answer, she realized, lay within the tower itself. Determined to uncover the truth, Elyse prepared to climb into the heart of the clock. The blueprint fragment in her hand seemed to pulse with meaning, its cryptic message guiding her forward. Time is truth. But as the next midnight approached, the weight of the clock's judgment pressed heavier than ever. The tower was alive with purpose, and Elyse could feel its gaze upon her. Whatever secrets it held, they would not be revealed without a price. The clock tower loomed larger than ever in Elyse Harper's mind. The puzzle pieces were beginning to fit together, but the full picture remained just out of reach. Each discovery pulled her closer to the realization that the answers she sought were locked inside the very mechanism that had reawakened the nightmare in Graystone. The tower was not just the site of tragedy, it was the epicenter of judgment. And Elyse knew she could no longer stay on the periphery of the mystery. She had to climb the tower. The town was eerily quiet as midnight approached, its streets barren under the dim glow of scattered lamplight. The tower's silhouette cut through the fog, its presence oppressive. Elyse stood at its base, gripping the fragment of Thomas's blueprint. The fragment had been the last trace of his brilliance and his warnings, and now it served as her guide. The door to the tower was heavy, its iron hinges groaning as she pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rust and time. Her footsteps echoed against the stone walls, accompanied only by the faint creaking of the gears overhead. She held her flashlight tightly, the beam slicing through the darkness to reveal the spiraling staircase that wound upward toward the clock's heart. As she ascended, the sound of the ticking clock grew louder, a rhythmic thrum that seemed to match the pounding of her heart. Each step felt heavier than the last, the air pressing down on her as if the tower itself were resisting her presence. The deeper she climbed, the more she felt the weight of the centuries-old betrayal that had seeped into the very stones. At the top of the tower, Elyse reached a chamber hidden behind a heavy wooden door. It was smaller than she had imagined, its walls lined with gears and levers, all part of the clock's intricate mechanism. But it wasn't the machinery that drew her attention. At the center of the room stood an ornate, full-length mirror framed in iron. The surface shimmered faintly, reflecting the light of her flashlight in a way that seemed almost alive. As she stepped closer, the mirror began to change. The reflection of the room dissolved, replaced by scenes that played out like fragments of a memory. Elyse watched, transfixed, as the mirror revealed the story of Thomas. She saw him sketching his designs with meticulous care, his eyes alight with passion. She saw the clock tower take shape under his direction, its gears and mechanisms coming together like the pieces of a symphony. But the images grew darker, showing the envy and resentment that festered among Graystone's elite. She watched as they conspired to ruin him, their whispers and lies weaving a net of betrayal. The mirror showed the trial, a mockery of justice where the evidence was fabricated and Thomas's protests fell on deaf ears. She saw the jeering crowd at his execution, their faces twisted with a mix of triumph and fear as the young craftsman met his end. His final words echoed through the chamber, clear and resolute. "I am not guilty, and you know this to be true. I will return." The reflection shifted again, this time showing the victims of the clock's recent chimes. Julia Crane, Richard Collins, Martin Lewis, Martha Green, Gerald Price. All of them appeared in the mirror, their faces superimposed over those of their ancestors who had played a role in Thomas's downfall. Finally, Elyse saw her own reflection. It wavered, her face merging with that of a man she recognized from the old council records, the notary who had signed the documents that sealed Thomas's fate. Her breath caught as the realization struck her. She was next. Elyse tore her gaze from the mirror, her mind racing. The fragment of the blueprint burned in her hand, its cryptic message, "*Time is truth," echoing in her thoughts. She looked around the room, her eyes falling on the mechanism that drove the clock. It was a masterpiece of engineering, but something about it felt off. Among the gears and levers, she spotted a hidden compartment, its edges barely visible behind a panel of polished brass. She pried it open, revealing a small metal plate engraved with an inscription in Thomas's hand. "The wheel turns until justice is done. To stop it is to accept the truth." Beneath the plate was a key, old and tarnished, but its purpose was clear. Elyse knew she had found the means to stop the clock, but the words of the inscription lingered in her mind. Stopping the clock meant more than silencing its chimes. It meant confronting the full weight of Thomas's legacy and the town's sins. The clock struck 12, its toll reverberating through the chamber like a thunderclap. Elyse stumbled, her hands gripping the edge of the mechanism for support. The mirror flared to life, its surface glowing with a brilliance that filled the room. For a moment, she thought she saw Thomas's reflection staring back at her, his eyes filled with both sorrow and defiance. The chime faded, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. Elyse's decision could wait no longer. With trembling hands, she inserted the key into the heart of the mechanism. The gears groaned in protest as she turned it, each movement requiring all her strength. The room seemed to resist her, the air thick with an unseen force. Finally, the gears ground to a halt. The ticking stopped, and the mirror's glow dimmed. The silence was deafening, as though the tower itself had drawn a final breath. As the mechanism stilled, the tower began to shake. Stones shifted, and dust rained from the ceiling. Elyse realized too late that stopping the clock had triggered something far greater than she had anticipated. The tower, bound to Thomas's curse, was beginning to collapse. She scrambled down the staircase, the walls groaning and splintering around her. Chunks of stone fell with deafening crashes, and the air filled with the acrid scent of smoke and metal. She stumbled out into the square just as the tower's topmost section crumbled inward, the entire structure folding in on itself with a thunderous roar. When the dust settled, all that remained of the clock tower was a heap of rubble. The clock face lay shattered among the debris, its hands forever frozen at 12 o'clock. The town awoke to find the clock tower gone, its imposing presence reduced to ruins. For many, its destruction was a relief, a symbol of the curse's end. But for Elyse, the story was far from over. She had seen the truth in the mirror, felt the weight of Thomas's final warning, and understood the depths of Graystone's guilt. In the days that followed, Elyse wrote an article detailing her findings. She didn't hold back, revealing the betrayal that had led to Thomas's execution and the dark legacy that had haunted Graystone ever since. The article was met with mixed reactions. Some praised her for uncovering the truth, while others resented her for dredging up the past. But Elyse knew that the clock's chimes had been more than a curse. They had been a reckoning, a demand for justice that could not be ignored. The dust hadn't yet settled in the hearts of Graystone's people. The destruction of the clock tower was both a relief and a wound. For the younger generation, it was a chance to move on, to leave behind a relic that had become synonymous with fear. For the elders, it was a gaping reminder of the sins they had long buried and the justice that had finally caught up with them. And for Elyse Harper, it was the final chapter of a story she couldn't yet bring herself to write. The square was cordoned off, but Elyse managed to convince the mayor's assistant to let her explore the wreckage. The pile of rubble that had once been the proud centerpiece of Graystone was now a chaos of shattered stone and twisted metal. The remnants of the clock mechanism lay scattered across the square, their intricate parts mangled beyond recognition. Elyse moved cautiously, her boots crunching on debris as she scanned the wreckage for anything that might have survived. Near the base of the ruins, she found a fragment of the mirror. Its edges were sharp, and its surface shimmered faintly in the sunlight. She picked it up carefully, holding it to the light. For a moment, she thought she saw an image flicker across its surface, a flash of gears and hands, moving in perfect unison. But when she blinked, the reflection was gone. She slipped the fragment into her bag and continued searching. Among the rubble, she found other remnants of Thomas's work. Pieces of gears engraved with his signature designs, fragments of inscriptions, and shards of glass from the clock face. Each piece told a fragment of his story, a tale of brilliance overshadowed by betrayal. Back in town, Elyse began reaching out to the elders again, this time with the authority of someone who had seen the truth. The mirror had shown her more than just the past. It had revealed the guilt that still clung to those who had benefited from Thomas's downfall. Agnes Mulroney was one of the first to speak openly. Her frail voice carried the weight of years of silence as she recounted the stories her father had told her. The council's decision to scapegoat Thomas, the forged documents that sealed his fate, and the quiet celebration that followed his execution. They thought they'd won, she said, her hands trembling in her lap. They thought they'd taken everything he had, but they didn't understand. They didn't see the mark he left behind. Others followed, their confessions hesitant but heartfelt. They spoke of family members who had signed false testimonies, who had profited from the theft of Thomas's land and designs. They described the envy and greed that had driven the town's elite to conspire against him, and the growing unease they had felt as the clock tower became a silent monument to their guilt. One of the elders, a reclusive man named Victor Halloway, surprised Elyse by inviting her into his home. Victor's grandfather had been one of the architects who worked with Thomas, a man who had initially supported him but later turned against him under pressure from the council. He kept a journal, Victor said, leading Elyse to a dusty attic where a collection of old books and papers lay untouched. I couldn't bring myself to read it, but I think it might help you understand. Elyse carefully opened the journal, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was neat and deliberate, each entry a window into the past. The journal chronicled the construction of the clock tower, the accidents that had sparked suspicion, and the growing rift between Thomas and the council. They came to me today, demanding I testify against Thomas. They said it was for the good of the town, that he was too dangerous to keep around. I knew it was a lie, but I signed the statement anyway. I had no choice. The clock watches everything. I wonder if it will forgive me. That night, Elyse examined the fragment of the mirror she had recovered from the ruins. She held it up to the light, watching as its surface shifted and shimmered. This time, the image was clear. Thomas stood at the base of the clock tower, his face solemn as he supervised its construction. Behind him, shadows gathered, figures she recognized from the photographs and records she had uncovered. They were the council members, the architects of his betrayal. The image shifted, showing the trial and execution once more. This time, Elyse noticed something she hadn't before. Thomas wasn't just staring at the crowd when he spoke his final words. He was staring at the tower. His eyes burned with a mixture of defiance and pain as he declared, "I will return." The reflection changed again, showing the recent victims of the clock's curse. Julia, Richard, Martin, Martha, Gerald. their faces blurred into those of their ancestors. Elyse's reflection appeared last, her face framed by the shadows of the notary who had signed the final damning document. The mirror fragment pulsed with energy, and Elyse felt a sudden surge of clarity. The clock's curse had been more than vengeance. It had been a reckoning, a demand for the truth to be acknowledged. The following morning, Elyse wrote her article. It was the most difficult piece she had ever composed. She described the clock tower's history, the brilliance of Thomas's designs, and the betrayal that had led to his death. She detailed the council's conspiracy, the forged evidence, and the town's silent complicity. She wrote of the curse, the deaths, and the destruction of the tower. But most of all, she wrote about the mirror. She described its power to reveal the truth, to hold up a reflection of guilt that could not be denied. She knew that some would call her story fiction, a fabrication meant to explain the inexplicable. But she also knew that those who had lived through the curse would understand. In the days that followed the publication of Elyse's article, the mood in Graystone shifted. The younger generation, who had been largely untouched by the events, saw the destruction of the clock tower as an opportunity for renewal. But for the elders, it was a reminder of the past they could no longer ignore. The square where the tower once stood remained empty, a gaping void in the heart of the town. A memorial was erected, a simple plaque that read, "In memory of those who sought the truth. Time forgives, but it never forgets." Elyse stayed in Graystone for a few more weeks, gathering the final pieces of Thomas's story. When she finally left, the fragment of the mirror remained with her, a reminder of the man whose brilliance and suffering had shaped the town's history. Graystone began to settle into an uneasy calm after the clock tower's destruction. The square, once the bustling heart of the town, now bore the weight of silence and loss. For some, the absence of the clock was a relief, a final closing of a chapter steeped in fear and superstition. For others, it was a haunting reminder of the cost of buried truths. Elyse Harper, however, found no solace. The fragmented mirror she had retrieved from the ruins rested on her desk like an unanswered question. It pulsed faintly under the light, as though it still held a sliver of life. Her article had revealed the betrayal, the conspiracy, and the curse, but it hadn't stopped the nightmares. Visions of the clock's face, its hands moving with an unrelenting purpose. There was something unfinished. The mirror fragment had become both a burden and a beacon. Elyse couldn't help but stare into it each night, hoping for clarity, but finding only more questions. The images it revealed were no longer as sharp as before, but they were insistent. Flashes of Thomas standing before the clock, his eyes fixed on the mechanisms with an intensity that spoke of more than craftsmanship. There was something he had left behind, something the destruction of the tower hadn't erased. It wasn't until Elyse dreamt of the clock's mechanism itself, a labyrinth of gears, pulleys, and levers, that she realized what the mirror was showing her. The clock wasn't just a machine. It was a message. The mirror pulsed again as she woke, her breath ragged. In its surface, she saw a single word etched in faint, glowing script. Below. Elyse returned to the ruins of the tower the next morning, the mirror fragment tucked securely in her bag. The square was quiet, the townsfolk avoiding it with a mix of reverence and fear. The wreckage of the clock tower had been cleared to one side, leaving the stone foundation exposed, a jagged outline of where the monument once stood. Following the word etched in the mirror, Elyse began to search the foundation. Hours passed as she combed through the rubble, but it wasn't until her flashlight caught the faint outline of a trapdoor near the base of the ruins that her heart quickened. The edges of the door were sealed with rust and age, but the engraving on its surface was unmistakable, a familiar geometric insignia she had seen in Thomas's blueprints. She pried it open, the groan of metal echoing into the square, and descended into the darkness below. The air was thick and cool as Elyse entered the chamber. The space was vast, its walls lined with shelves of gears, tools, and incomplete mechanisms. At the center stood a pedestal, atop which rested a large, circular plate engraved with intricate patterns. The design was hypnotic, its concentric circles drawing her eyes to the center. where a small depression was etched. Elyse reached for the mirror fragment, its faint glow intensifying as she held it over the plate. The fragment fit perfectly into the depression, clicking into place as if it had been waiting for this moment. The chamber shuddered, and the gears lining the walls began to turn. A low hum filled the air, growing louder until it resolved into a familiar sound, the rhythmic ticking of the clock. The pedestal began to glow, and a holographic image materialized above it. It was Thomas, or rather, a projection of him, his face calm, his voice clear but tinged with sorrow. "If you've come this far," the projection said, "then you've seen the truth. My work was never meant for vengeance, but for understanding. The tower was my masterpiece, a bridge between time and humanity. But it became something else, a monument to greed, betrayal, and the darkness in men's hearts." The image shifted, showing the town of Graystone as it had been during Thomas's life. The people were vibrant, their joy palpable as they celebrated the tower's completion. But then came the shadows, the council members conspiring, the accident staged, and finally, the trial. "My final words were not a curse," Thomas continued. "They were a promise. Time reveals all things. My work has endured not to punish, but to remind. If you are here now, you carry the weight of that truth. It is yours to preserve or destroy." The projection faded, leaving Elyse alone in the chamber. The pedestal's glow dimmed, but the ticking persisted, filling the air with its steady rhythm. She understood now. Thomas's legacy was not the curse but the clock itself, a testament to both the brilliance of creation and the fragility of trust. On the wall behind the pedestal, she noticed a lever. Its purpose was clear. Pulling it would halt the gears, silencing the clock forever. But doing so would erase what remained of Thomas's work. It would close the chapter, but it would also bury the reminder of the betrayal that had shaped Graystone's history. Elyse hesitated. She thought of the townsfolk, their fear and relief at the tower's destruction. She thought of the elders, weighed down by guilt, and the younger generations, eager to move on. She thought of herself, a witness to a story that had been hidden for too long. She placed her hand on the lever, her mind racing. Elyse stepped back. The clock's mechanism continued to tick, its rhythm steady and unyielding. She couldn't destroy it, not entirely. The story of Graystone, of Thomas, was not hers to erase. It was a truth that needed to endure, even if it was painful. Instead, she retrieved the mirror fragment from the pedestal, its glow fading as the mechanism stilled. The ticking ceased, leaving the chamber in silence once more. Elyse ascended the ladder, leaving the trapdoor ajar behind her. The clock's heartbeat was gone, but its memory remained. In the weeks that followed, Elyse left Graystone. Her article had shaken the town, sparking debates, apologies, and, for some, quiet reflection. The square remained empty, its void a silent reminder of what had been lost and what had been revealed. Elyse kept the mirror fragment, its faint shimmer a companion in her new life. She carried with her the weight of what she had seen and the knowledge that time, relentless and impartial, had a way of balancing the scales. The clock's hands remained still, but the memory of its chimes echoed forever in the hearts of those who had heard them. Thank you for watching. Please subscribe to the channel, and I'd love to hear your comments.